Hey students, welcome back, and we are going to get into chapter 4 part 1, and we are going to focus in this lecture completely on the issue of slavery in the North American British colonies. And we're going to focus on the African slave trade. We are going to focus on the Atlantic slave trade, the crossing, the Middle Passage, and we are going to also talk about the experiences that slaves had as they reached the shores of these North American colonies. So here you have our key terms, and we are going to, like I said, begin by talking about the Atlantic slave trade, what is driving the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to talk about the Middle Passage. We're going to talk about Odala Equiano, who is a famous African who wrote about his experiences as a slave, had a very remarkable life. We're going to talk about the slave market. What was it like to, be bought and sold in these slave markets? And then we're going to talk about slave culture and this becoming African American, what it means to become African American. We're going to talk a little bit about the task system, which is one of the labor systems that was put in place in the South for slaves. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Stono Rebellion, which is the only successfully executed slave rebellion that happened during American colonial times, during the American colonies. All right, let's get started. Okay, so you can see here by the slide, 1770, you've got double population in the southern colonies than what you have in the middle and northern colonies. Why is that? That is because of the slave trade, and that is because of the importation of enslaved people. By 1770, there were over 400,000 people in the South of African ancestry. Nearly all of them were slaves. By the time we get to the eve of the Civil War in the United States, which is where this course is going to end, in 1860, you've got 4 million enslaved people. So you can see that the population is going to grow considerably in that short period of time. The South was really divided into two distinct economic zones. There was the Upper South, which included Virginia and the Chesapeake region, and this was the one that was settled first, right? So that includes Jamestown, it includes Maryland, it includes that entire Chesapeake region. And the primary commodity that was grown there was tobacco. And then you have the Lower South, which includes the Carolinas and Georgia, and there rice and indigo was grown. By 1770, labor on these plantations was run almost exclusively by slave labor from Africa, and these plantations were run in a violent fashion. So let's begin. Okay, so you can see here, this is a map that is showing us this trade that took place between North America, Europe, and Africa. This is known as the triangular trade or the triangular economy. Basically, you want to start in Europe because I know we think of, of course, America has got to be the center of everything. But at this time, the center of everything was Europe, right? And so if you begin with England, what you're going to get from England are all types of manufactured goods. So manufactured goods, tools, guns, clothing, those types of things are going to be built, manufactured in England, and then they are going to be sent out. Now, we're going to talk about the triangular trade as it relates to Africa. So you have these manufactured goods. They're coming out of Europe from British ports, and then they are coming down the coast of Africa to what was known then as the Slave Coast. and slaves were brought to these forts along the coast. And keep in mind that these slaves were not just from these coastal communities. A lot of times these slaves were brought from the interior of Africa. In fact, Equiano had been brought from the interior of Africa to these coastal slave forts. Now, the slaves are then traded for some of those manufactured goods, right? Most notably guns and weapons of any sort. And that's going to cause all kinds of political instability in Africa, not to mention the fact that, people are being taken out of Africa in large numbers, put onto slave ships, and then they make the passage over to America. Now, there are different routes that would be taken, but this is called the Middle Passage because this is the middle part of this triangular trade. The slaves would be taken, to the plantation communities of the South. They would sometimes have stopovers in what was called the West Indies. We'll call it the Caribbean now. And so they would, large numbers being brought here. Okay. Now the slaves are being brought here. Now what's being brought out of North America are raw materials. So you have things like furs and fish, natural resources, forests, timber, rice, indigo, tobacco, all of those things that are being manufactured in the American colonies, and then they are then sent back to England. And that's basically the way that it went. Now there are like little branches of different types of other trade that was happening, but the triangular trade typically goes from England to Africa, from Africa over to the Americas, and then from the Americas back to England. And so this was all part of this much larger economy. So slaves were brought either directly to the American South or they were brought to the Caribbean. The voyage to the Americas killed many, many Africans. It is estimated that on average 20% of all Africans that were put on these slave ships would die simply on the passage over, from sickness, from disease, malnutrition, from a brutality, from being beaten, and sometimes from suicide. When the Atlantic slave trade is finally done and over with, 12.5 million Africans will have been taken from the continent of Africa and brought over to the Americas. Of that 12.5 million, about 500,000 of those Africans will be brought to North America, to colonial North America. So that represents about 6% of the total, which doesn't sound like a lot, but through natural increase, through population increase, through slaves in North America having babies, basically, like I said, by the time you get to the time of the Civil War, you've got 4 million enslaved people in North America and America. The majority of the Africans that were brought to British North America were brought during this 60-year time span between 1720 and 1780. This is the height of the slave trade period. The majority of them are being brought on British ships, but there were other European powers that also engaged in the slave trade. So nobody was entirely innocent of this slave trade, but the majority of the ships were British, British-owned ships. The slave trade itself from Africa is outlawed in 1807. It will go into effect in 1808. So from 1808 forward, it is actually illegal to take a person from Africa and bring them over to America, but there was still a lot of illegal slave trade happening after that. And we'll talk more about that when I talk about the actual slave market. But this is going to be kind of an interesting thing that happens in British North America, because when the African slave trade, not slavery, slavery was still legal. Slavery is legal in the United States until 1865 in the passage of the 13th Amendment. But the slave trade itself, when that is outlawed, that does some interesting things to the slave economy in America. So what are the commodities that are driving the slave trade in the Americas? Well, I have already mentioned quite a few. One of the biggest ones was actually sugar, and that's the reason why you're going to see so many slaves actually being brought to the Caribbean and also to South America, where a lot of sugar is grown. Tobacco, of course, is a huge one, particularly in Virginia and the Chesapeake region. Rice, as I've already mentioned, in the Carolinas and Georgia. Cotton will be a commodity that will be introduced by the time we get to the 19th century. So we will not see big, massive cotton plantations in America until we get into the 1800s. But certainly cotton plantations were huge when it came to slavery. Indigo plantations, indigo being the plant that makes a nice blue dye. So here you're looking at a map of where slaves were taken from in Africa. You might be surprised to know that some slaves were actually taken from southeastern Africa, also some from Madagascar, as far south as Angola and the Congo. The majority of the slaves that were brought to North America were from this slave coast area that I showed you on the previous map. But one of the things I want to point out is that the majority of the slaves, remember I said 12.5 million African people stolen from Africa, brought to the Americas. 6% of those went to British North America, but the remainder, the 94%, will go to the Caribbean and also to South America. Also, incidentally, Brazil was the last country in the Americas to outlaw slavery. That happens in 1888. But we are pretty close, because we didn't outlaw slavery up here in America until 1865. You can see here the percentage, the breakdown here of the various regions in Africa where the slaves are being taken from. And then you can see here the breakdown of the various regions in the Americas that the slaves are being taken to. So this is a model of a typical slave ship. You will notice that it is very large. The hull of the ship especially is very large, where the human cargo was stored. The middle passage itself, as I mentioned already, was particularly severe. There were a lot of deaths that happened as a result of sickness, brutality, suicide. There were horrific conditions. Not only, of course, were these human beings frightened because they didn't, many of them, understand exactly what was going on, but they were treated like property, like animals. They were treated horrifically. And this is a difference, a big difference between the type of slavery that had existed prior to the American form of slavery, which is more like chattel slavery. Chattel meaning like kind of the way that you treat an animal, like a farm animal or a beast of burden or something like that. And the type of slavery that existed in Africa prior to this, which was much more of a it was a different type of slavery. In other words, the slave was still seen as a human being. This was a whole nother level of cruelty. So here you can see a diagram of how to pack a slave ship in order to maximize profit. So people actually, studied this stuff and actually passed on this information so that these slavers could, like I said, maximize their profit. And again, an average of 20% of them are going to die in the passage across. And so you wanted to ensure that you were going to have as many people on that ship as possible. So here you have a reenactment of what this type of cargo storing would have looked like. You can see how people are packed in on racks that they are chained together. All of the descriptions of these slave ships are very, very brutal in terms of its description of smell, of the uncomfortableness of this situation for people that needed to relieve themselves. There were buckets provided, but oftentimes those buckets spilled. And so people would be laying in their own excrement and urine, and this would cause all kinds of sores. Of course, it would cause lesions that would then become infected and could cause disease. So it was a very, very cruel and inhumane environment. So as I've already referenced, this particular stretch between Africa and the Americas is known as the Middle Passage. It is the one that is the passage that basically describes this voyage where millions of Africans were forced to make from the 15th to the 19th century. As I mentioned already, an average of 20% of Africans transported across the Atlantic died on passage. Malnutrition, dehydration, unsanitary conditions, violent slave keepers, disease, suicide in some cases. It was an extremely brutal environment. The majority of the people who were taken were men, but women were also taken. And especially in places like British North America, women were often sold, and they were sold for the purposes of having babies, but they were also sold for more sort of sinister purposes as well, including the sexual satisfaction of the male slave master. So here is an image of Odalwa Equiano. He is this incredible African man who was born in Africa, sold into slavery when he was 11 years old, makes this journey from the interior of Africa to the African coast, is loaded onto a slave ship, taken across the Middle Passage, eventually sold in Barbados, where he works on a sugar plantation, then makes his way to the Carolinas, where he works on a plantation there, and eventually is sold again and put on a ship and travels over to Europe. He just eventually, through all of these adventures, ends up in England, where he is hooked up with a group of abolitionists, people who are anti-slavery. And he eventually will be able to buy his freedom. And when he does, he writes a narrative of his life. And it is just this remarkable primary source. And I provided a bit of that primary source for you to read in your module this week. And he publishes this book. And when the book gets published in the late 18th century, it really has quite an impact on people because they realize the brutality of the slave trade, and not just the slave trade, but also the brutality and the reality that exist for enslaved people on a regular basis. So when the slave ships arrived at the coastal cities, the slaves were unloaded and they were put up for sale at the slave market. Now, first off, one of the most strangest things, remarkable things, gross things, I guess, about these slave ships is that people knew when they were going to arrive because they could smell them. If the wind was blowing in a particular direction, if you were getting the wind off of the ocean, you could actually smell a slave ship before it arrived. That is how unsanitary the conditions were on the slave ship. When the slaves were unloaded from the slave ship, of course, they would have been extremely frightened. Some of them were traveling in family groups. If they hadn't already been separated from their families, it was possible that they could be separated from their families at this point. And that is one of the most remarkable and heart-wrenching parts of this entire story is the separation of families that occurred at these slave markets. These slave markets treated these human beings as if they were possessions, as if they were animals to be inspected. And the price of the slaves were very high. I mean, but keep in mind that these planters, these people who own these massive plantations in the South, they were some of the richest people in the American colonies, if not the richest people. So the price of a slave really depended upon their physical condition and their age and also their gender. So, for example, the highest price would be paid for a man who was in his prime, maybe a young man somewhere between the age of like 17 to, like 25. That would be, and, they were looked at as being strong and healthy and able-bodied. A woman would, the price of a female would typically be made based on her perceived attractiveness. And women were also highly valued because of their ability to reproduce. Because keep in mind that in this chattel slavery system, the children of slaves are also slaves. And so you could, if you were a slave owner, if you had a female who was procreating, then you could then get an additional slave out of that. So the prices at this time were anywhere between $300 to $800. Those are actual contemporary prices for the time. That would essentially be the price of like a used car today, right? So it would be in the several $1,000 range. New slaves were often referred to as new Negroes. They typically did not speak English, and they would have to be acculturated by other more experienced slaves. Many of them were frightened. Some tried to run away. Some settled down and learned to adapt to their new life on the plantation. All of them experienced incredible hardship because not only are you working very, very hard on a daily basis, you also are exposed to, the potential for abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, any kind of abuse you could think of could be inflicted on human beings that were considered property. So this is a table that shows us the colonial slave population in 1770. So you'll notice here some interesting things I'm just going to point out really quickly. So the largest raw population numbers for colonial slaves were in Virginia. where you have 187,600 slaves. This again is 1770. That represented 42% of Virginia's overall population. But look at South Carolina. South Carolina has 75,168 slaves, but that represents 61% of the overall population of South Carolina, which means, of course, that the majority of people living in South Carolina were African slaves. So that's an interesting thing to look at because the larger the slave population in terms of percentage, the harsher the slave laws are going to be, the stricter the punishments are going to be, etc., because there is a real fear of rebellion. Also, I mean, just another one, Georgia here. Georgia has, in 1770, 15,000 enslaved people, but that makes up 45% of their population. And as I mentioned already, the other colonies also had slavery. They certainly were not exempt. And so you can see here, New Jersey has a significant number of slaves, Connecticut, Pennsylvania. The lowest number of slaves was in New Hampshire at just 654, which represented 1% of that population. So one of the things that's important to understand about slavery in the United States is that despite the fact that people were brought here from Africa, from different regions of Africa. In fact, sometimes you would get people on the same plantation when they first arrived speaking different dialects of African and not really being able to understand each other. But slowly over time, this African American culture emerges, right? And this African American culture is really a blend of these different African cultures that were brought over and the European and Christian and American traditions that existed in colonial America. And so it's a really sort of interesting blend of all of these things. We know for a fact that slaves continued to carry on a lot of their African traditions, particularly when it came to religious beliefs. When it came to music, for example, a lot of the African rhythms were incorporated into music that was played in the slave quarters. And there was some free time available to slaves, typically on a Sunday. So they did have time to have get-togethers, have dances, have play music. The banjo instrument was actually originally an African instrument, and that was brought over and adapted here in America, and of course becomes the basis of a lot of the Southern bluegrass music. So there are so many things about the African culture that really permeate into American culture, even during the times of slavery. But the important thing here is really, to me, the important thing is the endurance of the human spirit. Despite the fact that these people were enslaved, they continued to live and exist and carry on cultural traditions. They continued to marry each other, even though their marriages weren't legally recognized. They continued to practice their religious traditions, even though their religious traditions were not recognized within the confines of Christianity. They continued to have family units and raise their children and try to love their children and teach their children stories. Their stories that were passed down in slave culture about freedom, about finding a way to freedom, about hope. There's so many stories of endurance and empowerment. And so I want to make clear that despite the fact that these human beings were enslaved, their human spirit endured, and their African traditions and cultures still survived, even if it was just in small ways. Okay, so there were a lot of different variations when it came to labor systems throughout the slave colonies, and it really depended upon where you were, where you lived in the colony. So, in the Chesapeake region, in Virginia, for example, and in the Chesapeake area, the slaves there were very closely supervised by whites, and so because of that, there was a lot of crossover of culture. Typically, slaves in the Chesapeake tended to have more of a grasp of the English language, despite the fact that they were not allowed to learn to read or write. They typically did learn English. They did have a lot of conversion in the Chesapeake areas to Christianity. And a lot of times on these tobacco plantations, the slaves were required to go to church with the white people. They, of course, didn't sit with them, but they would hear the same sermons, and they would a lot of times the sermons were geared towards trying to reconcile the Bible and slavery, trying to make excuses for slavery in the Bible, justifying slavery using the Bible. Right, and because people, enslaved people in the Chesapeake had this closer interaction with whites, they tended to have a little bit of a different culture where they acculturated more towards the American version of the enslaved person. In the lower South, there was a little bit more of a separation. So in these lower southern plantations, on the rice plantations, on the indigo plantations, and later on the cotton plantations, there was something called the task system. And this was basically, it was because there wasn't enough whites to oversee a lot of the activity of the slaves on the plantations. So slaves were given a specific task. And once they completed that task, they could be done for the day. And because there was more of a separation between the enslaved Africans in the lower South and the whites, that there tended to be more African-based culture in the lower South, in the Carolinas, in Georgia, and later on in other parts of the lower South, like Mississippi, Alabama, etc. And so you're going to start to get, you see more African names, more African languages continuing there. The Gula language, which is like a mix of various African languages and English kind of blending together. So it's interesting that these labor systems really reflected kind of the ways in which slaves culturated and slaves lived, because depending upon how much interaction the slave had with whites and white culture, that really kind of defined what their everyday experience would be like. All slaves, regardless of where they are, worked to themselves to the bone from sun up to sundown. It was, you were supposed to be doing something, supposed to be working. And keep in mind that physical intimidation and physical punishment was the primary way in which the whites were able to assert their authority. And it was the way in which they understood to keep people who are enslaved to continue to work. So fear, it was based on fear, it was based on violence. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about the Stono Rebellion. This is the largest uprising in 18th century colonial history when it comes to slavery. And that's not to say that enslaved people didn't rise up and resist their enslavement. They did, but they did it typically in small ways. So there might be small acts of violence, or there might be small acts of sabotage of equipment. There might be work slowdowns, right? Maybe you're not working quite as hard or as fast as you could because you're protesting. And so there was lots of different secret subversions that took place, and that was the most typical form of resistance. This large-scale violent uprising is very rare, actually, surprisingly, in North American slave history. And a lot of that is due to that violence of the overseer, and the violence and the threat of punishment if there was an uprising. But there was a very large uprising, and it happened in 1739, and it happened in along the Stono River in South Carolina. So along the Stono River in South Carolina, a group of about 20 slaves, they think probably from the Congo region, took some weapons, stole some weapons from a local store, and they began a plundering and burning of the plantation, which will end up killing more than 20 whites. And so they're moving along the Stono River, they're moving south along the Stono River, and they are just attacking full scale these plantations and the plantation owners. And they were going somewhere. They were going to St. Augustine, Florida. Now, the reason why they were going to St. Augustine, Florida was because St. Augustine, Florida at the time was owned by the Spanish. And the Spanish had a special community in St. Augustine called Fort Mose for free Africans. And so the slaves had heard through these various networks, and probably through Native American networks, honestly, because the Native Americans did a lot of trading up and down the eastern seaboard. And so the Native Americans probably brought word to these enslaved Africans, hey, if you make it down from South Carolina down to Florida, St. Augustine, to Fort Mose, then you can be free. So it's pretty clear that this group of Congolese enslaved people had heard about Fort Mose, and they were heading down the road to try to get to St. Augustine, Florida. They ultimately were hunted down by a posse who basically immediately captured them and beheaded them and put their heads up on spikes along the road to St. Augustine. And the reason why they were doing this is because they were trying to send a message to other enslaved people. This is what will happen to you if you try to do this. So the Stono Rebellion is important not just because it is the largest slave uprising in colonial history in North America, but it is also important because after this, there are going to be more enforcement of slave laws. That there are going to be stricter slave laws. Slaves are going to be more restricted in their ability to move, in their ability to get information, to have interactions with other people. And as we start to see these various uprisings, the two biggest really in American history are the Stono Rebellion, and later on the Nat Turner Rebellion. And these two very violent slave rebellions are a testament and a reminder to the fact that these people are enslaved and they are being forced to, against their will, do the work that they are being forced to do. And that is scary to those slave owners who, as these rebellions become more frequent or as they start to become violent, they want to really put a clamp down on it. So we're going to start to see stricter slave laws after the Stono Rebellion. So that is all for Chapter 4, Part 1. I will see you Chapter 4, Part 2. Have a good one.